This is week 8, audio 4. So now we're going to talk about post-Tiananmen China, beginning in 1989, although it says 1990 here. Let's go on to slide 21. Immediately after the Tiananmen massacre occurred, U.S. policy makers decided that the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China needed to be salvaged. There was, I think, never any idea that the U.S. would break off diplomatic relations or anything like that. If you read the book by James Lilly, China Hands, there's a very interesting account of all the hell that the embassy went through during that period. On the 7th of June, for example, a unit from the 27th Army went down Chang'an Avenue from Tiananmen Square, traveling east. They approached the area of the Jianguo Menwai diplomatic apartments, where the Americans had most of their people. They stopped. They trained their .50 caliber machine guns toward the building and began firing through the windows. They, the late Ambassador Lilly, writing in his book, this is a man who was the first CIA station chief in China in the 70s, wrote authoritatively that they were aiming for American apartments. And indeed, in one of the apartments, there was a Chinese caregiver with a bunch of little kids who scrambled and dived on top of them as the bullets came whizzing through the windows. A telephone call had been given to a U.S. Army officer who was in the Defense Attaché office the day before, from an anonymous, not so anonymous Chinese Army officer. He said, "Do you know who this is?" And his voice was recognizable, and this guy, Larry Wurtzel was his name, said, "Yes, I know who you are. I want you to not be in your apartment tomorrow." What are you talking about? "Don't be in your apartment tomorrow," was the message. And so Major Wurtzel went to talk to Lilly. They decided that would be a great time to have an all-hands meeting to discuss with all the embassy personnel and their spouses what was going on. But they didn't tell them to bring all the little kids with them. So fortunately, no little kids were killed. But this was indeed a very purposeful message that was sent to the United States. Maybe not by Deng Xiaoping, maybe by Deng Xiaoping. Whether it was somebody in the military who decided to do this, or it was a decision made from the top, is still a mystery. But things were not good between the American and Chinese sides. However, George Bush had, like many leaders before him, had in mind, I have to say, loftier goals. His lofty goal was to make sure that the Chinese did not end up going over to the side of the Russians. I think that's the most obvious and direct way to state it. He didn't want a sudden reversal of the good fortunes of the recent years of the Cold War. So there was never any thought of breaking off relations, although if a couple of those kids had been decapitated by .50 cal rounds, then it might have been a different story. Because after all, every government has to pay attention to its various constituencies, and the U.S. government had Congress to worry about. The executive branch did anyway. And you can see that reflected in these talking points that were given to Brent Scowcroft, or Scowcroft is how you say his name, the national security advisor for George Bush at the time. He and a senior State Department officer who is Deputy Secretary of State named Lawrence Eagleburger went to Beijing in the last 2 days of June and into the first week of July, and held discussions with Deng Xiaoping. In official records, they always say July. They don't say June, because we don't want to have sent somebody to go to Beijing in the same month. We should have a decent interval, shouldn't we? But anyway, they went, and their main points are, I've taken a few out of this, and you can find these, by the way, in declassified telegrams that are part of a National Security Archives. It's called. That's the National Security Archives. It's run by George Washington University. So if you just do a web search on George Washington University or GWU and National Security Archives, you'll come across it. So, as I say, the main point was to keep the Chinese from going over to the Russians. And the bottom line was that if there are further arrests and executions, as there have been many of them, this will lead to greater demands in the U.S. to respond. However, if there's effort at national reconciliation, it'll be easier for the U.S. to find a cooperative response that can be bought off on by Congress and that won't get us thrown out during the next election. I'm not being cynical. I'm just being truthful. But meantime, going on to slide 22, internally at least, the CCP was doubling down. They were making arrests. There was a very memorable case where a man in a Beijing suburb had been weeping in front of a CNN camera. That's a U.S. cable news network camera. And he said, "Oh my God, I can't believe the People's Army has slaughtered the people. This is horrible." And he was going on and on. So CNN broadcast about 20 seconds of that. And the Chinese state television picked it up, and the leadership told them to rebroadcast it. And so they did. They rebroadcast everything the guy said on Chinese television. And then an announcer came on and said, "Whoever has information about the identity of this criminal should report it immediately to the closest public security bureau station." And indeed, everybody who knew him said to themselves, "Oh my God, if I don't report this guy, my family and I might disappear within about 17 minutes. And so he was immediately reported. That's the way these things go. That's the kind of government we're talking about. So, Deng Xiaoping had this meeting with the broader, the extended Central Military Commission, just to make sure that the word got down as far as possible. Central Military Commission being one of the most powerful bodies in the country. Indeed, Deng Xiaoping, though he was not General Secretary of the party and he was not Prime Minister, he remained, from the time he came back to power until the time he died, he remained the head of the Central Military Commission. And Jiang Zemin, who's standing next to him there, the former mayor, or not the mayor, but the party secretary of Shanghai, who was soon to become the general secretary of the party because of his brilliant performance during the Tiananmen problems in Shanghai. Once he took over, and Deng Xiaoping, during his tenure, Deng Xiaoping passed away. When power was passed to the next man, who just retired, named Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin stayed on as the head of the Central Military Commission. So, now you know where the real power is. Not to say that this is a military dictatorship. It's It's an authoritarian government where the military is the kingmaker, you might say. So as I said before, there was an extensive purge conducted inside the party. There were people in the party and people in the military who were not quick enough to side with the government, and they had to go, and they did go. Indeed, the purge-like actions that occurred were rather widespread through society. For example, everybody who was in college at the time, in university, when they graduated, they had to go out to the countryside to spend a year working with the peasants, just like in the Cultural Revolution. Except they weren't slopping pig stuff in southern Anhui. They might be sent to southern Anhui, but they were usually sent to party offices to do office work and to learn about the countryside and stuff like that, wearing white shirts all day long and going back somewhere where they could bathe every night and not have to smell like pig shit, which is good. It's a good thing. So during this time, which was a high tide of, you might say, conservatism, you remember Chen Yun. He's the older gentleman who we saw previously. He had been an economist for a long time. He's in slide 24 coming up. You'll see his shiny face again. But Chen Yun was a party economic conservative and did not like all these things that Deng Xiaoping had been doing to let all this foreign influence into China. And so his arguments in the Politburo won the day, because Deng Xiaoping, first of all, he was kind of upset himself about all these things and was in a conservative mood, but he was not a dictator like Mao was. He was a first among equals. He did run things, and he was the most respected person in the party, but it was not like Mao Zedong. As a matter of fact, there's been a sort of a downshifting, if you will, in prestige and power from Mao to Deng to Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao. But now, with the new leader Xi Jinping, that downshifting in prestige may actually reverse itself, but we shall see, and I'm getting ahead of myself. So right after this meeting is, I was not in Beijing for the Tiananmen massacre, but I came about 18 months later, and when I began living there as a young U.S. diplomat, the place was dreary, really dreary. Getting into the airport and driving into town from the airport in the evening, I was impressed at how dark it was. It was like no lights anywhere at all. It was like being out in the middle of the farm fields, but you're in Beijing. And if you were, for example, if you wanted to go out to have dinner on a Friday night, the only place you could go was a few of the big hotels. There were no private restaurants at all. Nothing. There were some state-owned restaurants. One of the favorite places my family and I used to like to go was called Chunzhong Baozi. Bao, you know, baozi, the pork bun things. Bao for the masses. That's what the place was called. They served tasty bao. That's all they served. No drinks, no vegetables, nothing else. But it was a cool place to go and sit down and be with Chinese people and maybe chat with them and so on. And the kids didn't get sick when we ate there, so it was all good. But there was no place to go. There were tourist sites to go see in the day, but there were no attractions. And one of the things that we used to like to do with our kids was go to one of the parks where There were places for kids to run around, and we would sometimes take them to a foreign hotel where there were actual clean spaces for them to run around. But Beijing was a dreary, dreary place during this period. And indeed, one fine afternoon, right after our car arrived, we went and parked near the Russian embassy because there was a new market that had sprouted up there where you could buy vegetables and various handicrafts and things. We thought that was really great. And we're getting back into our car. I'm placing my children into the baby seats when up comes a buzzsaw haircut guy in a what you might call a Mao suit, and he says, "You must take me to the American embassy immediately." And I said, why would you want to go to the American embassy on a Sunday? It's Sunday and the embassy is closed. "You don't understand. You've got to take me to the American embassy right away. It's a matter of extreme importance to your government." Well, I'll tell you what. Here's my card. Why don't you call me on Monday morning, and I'm sure we can talk about it. It all sounds very interesting. But right now, I'm going to leave, and you'd better step away from my car. Because I had kids, and you know how parents are. They get protective of their children when some state security agent comes up and tries to trap you into being declared persona non grata and bounced out of the country like a Super Bowl. Anyway, that's the way it was in Beijing. But in the South, going on to slide 23, in the South things were different. I went down there to the area right opposite Hong Kong and Macau, to Shenzhen and Haikou, and not Haikou, Shenzhen and Taishan and a few other places in that region of Guangdong province. By the man I was replacing in the commercial section, his industrial sectors were electronics and machine tools and things like that. And I was taking over his portfolio, and he was taking me down there to introduce me to all of his contacts. A contact I had met a couple years previously when I was still working for the Commerce Department and went to Hong Kong on a research trip, was this man here, Larry Yung, or Rong Zhejian. He was the son of the very famous red capitalist Rong Yiren, who was the first head of CITIC, the China International Trade and Investment Corporation. Larry Yung, at this time, was running a semiconductor manufacturing business in Hong Kong that was Chinese-owned. And that's one reason why I went to see him, to understand his trade and purchasing requirements from the U.S. a little bit better. And there were lots of people like him in southern China at this particular time of history. And they were doing booming business. They were manufacturing for foreign businesses. They were running their own manufacturing to sell products in the rest of China. Whether it was the first personal computers in China were being made at this time in this place in Shenzhen by the company that's now known as Lenovo. Back then they were known as Legend Computers, or in Chinese Lianxiang. I think they're still called Lianxiang in Chinese. So things were different down there. It was like night and day. It was a very dynamic environment. There was a lot of money, and it was not like Beijing at all. Beijing, the emperor was high and far away. And the people who were running all this were all connected to senior party leaders or their children. Very interesting situation. And indeed, as the 90s progressed, once things loosened up a little bit, then what happened was that the people who ended up owning all the businesses, imagine this coincidence, they just happened to all be connected to party leaders. Wow, it's amazing. It's not what you know, it's who you know. Going on to slide 24. So in 1992, Deng Xiaoping had been planning for a while to find a way to reinvigorate the economy and put the conservatives, now at this point Chen Yun was his opponent, on the defensive. And so what he did was he took a trip south, or the Nanshun as it's called, and he went around this place I was just talking about, Shenzhen, and he went to Wuhan, which was also in central China, which was also a center of a nascent economic activity at the time. And he said, "This is good." He couldn't really make big stump speeches at this point because he's about 80 years old, but he made clear that what was happening was good for China, and he challenged people to go find another job if they didn't agree with him. And indeed, these were words that a lot of people were waiting to hear. The party propaganda department, which was a conservative element at the time, refused to allow publication by newspapers of the details of his trip for about a month. But then finally they couldn't hold back any longer, and once the details of his trip were published, everything began to change, and it began to change very quickly. We'll stop here and go on to audio 5 on slide 25 and finish this thing up.